He was the villain that helped build an empire, the rebel who changed the game with a microphone and a smirk. He was Roddy Piper, one of the most charismatic, captivating, and downright infuriating performers in the history of pro wrestling. For a time, he was the most hated man in the World Wrestling Federation, the perfect foil to its greatest hero, and a key engine that drove the entire company forward. He was in the main event of the very first WrestleMania, an event that staked the future of the industry on the hatred he could generate. And yet, for all his influence, for all the tickets he sold and the ratings he drew, there's one line on his resume that remains conspicuously blank. Roddy Piper was never, not for a single day, the WWF World Heavyweight Champion. Why? Why would a promoter, a businessman as sharp and ruthless as Vince McMahon, deny his top antagonist the one prize that defines greatness? The answer isn't about talent. It's about something far more primal, something that speaks to the very heart of power and control. The answer lies in the standoff between Piper and the one man who stood between him and the ultimate prize, Vince McMahon himself. This is the story of the backstage war that defined a legend's career, and the reason why some stars are just too dangerous to be champion. To understand the man who would become Roddy Piper, you have to understand the story he told about the boy, Roderick Toombs. He was born in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada, but his childhood, as he described it, was anything but stable. He claimed his father was a railroad cop, a job that kept the family constantly moving from town to town. This nomadic life, which he said included stays on an indigenous reserve, often made him an outsider, forcing him to learn how to use his fists to defend himself. The instability wasn't just geographical. His relationship with his father was turbulent, a clash of wills that would define his teenage years. According to Piper's own account, after he was expelled from junior high for carrying a switchblade, the tension at home boiled over. At just 13 years old, Roderick Toombs left home, hitting the road and surviving in youth hostels, a self-described runaway. It was a brutal education, but it was in this crucible that the foundations of Roddy Piper were laid. He learned to be tough, not as a performance, but as a necessity. He took up amateur boxing and wrestling, finding an outlet for his aggression. He also found a strange solace in an unlikely instrument, the bagpipes. He became remarkably proficient, a skill that would later become an iconic part of his wrestling persona, a piece of his past carried into his future. The way Piper told it, he stumbled into professional wrestling by chance. A 15-year-old living in a youth hostel, he was offered $25 to fill in for a wrestler who no-showed. He had his bagpipes with him, and the announcer, knowing only his name was Roddy, introduced him as Roddy the Piper. His first official match against the veteran Larry the Axe Hennig supposedly lasted all of 10 seconds. But it was a start. It was a way out. This wasn't some kid with dreams of fame and glory. This was a survivor who saw a path. He worked the grueling circuits of North America, learning the craft. He discovered he was a natural heel, a villain. The chip on his shoulder, the quick wit, and the short temper that had been liabilities in his youth were assets in the squared circle. He learned how to make a crowd truly hate him. Legend has it he once nearly caused a riot in Los Angeles by promising to play the Mexican national anthem on his bagpipes, only to play La Cucaracha instead. He wasn't playing a character. He was turning the volume up on who he already was, a fighter, a survivor, and an outsider who refused to be broken. This upbringing forged a man who was self-reliant to a fault, a man who learned young that the only person he could truly count on was himself. He wasn't bred for corporate structure, he was built to defy it. And that defiant, unbreakable spirit was exactly what would make him a superstar, and exactly what would put him on a collision course with Vince McMahon. Before he ever set foot in the WWF's Rockin' Wrestling era, Roddy Piper was already a master of his craft. In the late 70s and early 80s, he carved out a reputation in the territories of the National Wrestling Alliance, from Hollywood to the Mid-Atlantic. While other wrestlers relied on their size or strength, Piper's greatest weapon was his mind and his microphone. Working for promotions like Jim Crockett Promotions, he perfected the art of the promo. He wasn't just yelling, he was dissecting his opponents, weaving insults and psychological warfare into monologues that felt dangerously real. He feuded with legends like Ric Flair and Jack Briscoe, winning regional titles like the NWA United States Heavyweight Championship. But the titles were almost secondary. Piper's true value was his ability to talk people into the building just to see him get his teeth knocked out. His quick wit was never more evident than during his time as a commentator for Georgia Championship Wrestling. He wasn't just calling moves, he was an antagonist, using his platform to build feuds and belittle the heroes. The industry began to understand that Piper wasn't just another wrestler, he was a one-man show. This period culminated in one of the most brutal encounters of his career, a vicious dog collar match against Greg the Hammer Valentine at the first ever Starrcade in 1983. The two men were chained together at the neck, and the resulting brawl was a spectacle of violence that left Piper with severe damage to his left ear and significant permanent hearing loss. It also cemented his reputation. He was tough, he was fearless, and he was a star. When Vince McMahon Jr. began his national expansion, he needed performers who could captivate a national TV audience. And there was no personality larger, louder, or more captivating than Rowdy Roddy Piper. When Piper arrived full-time in the WWF in 1984, he wasn't just brought in to be another wrestler. He was brought in to be a catalyst. He had no idea just how big the explosion would be. Upon his arrival, and partially due to the lingering ear injury from his war with Valentine, Vince McMahon didn't immediately put Piper in a headlining wrestling role. Instead, he recognized Piper's unparalleled gift of gab and gave him his own platform, an interview segment called Piper's Pit. It would become the most explosive, unpredictable, and must-see segment in all of wrestling. There was no real script, just a tartan-draped set, a microphone, and Piper's incendiary mind. He'd invite guests, feign pleasantries, and then verbally tear them to shreds. It was an arena for psychological combat. And it was here that Piper created one of the most infamous moments of his career. He invited the beloved superstar Jimmy Superfly Snuka onto his set. After insulting Snuka's Polynesian heritage, Piper offered him pineapples and coconuts, seemingly as a peace offering, before violently smashing a coconut over Snuka's head. The audience was stunned. That single act of treachery defined Roddy Piper for a generation. He wasn't just a villain who cheated, he was a dangerous, unhinged sadist. Piper's Pit became a central strategy driver for the WWF, the place where many of its biggest feuds ignited. At the same time, Vince was pioneering his rock and wrestling connection, blending wrestling with the massive popularity of MTV. Pop star Cyndi Lauper was the face of this movement, bringing a new mainstream audience to the product. And who did McMahon choose as the wrestling world's antagonist to this pop culture invasion? Roddy Piper. Piper declared war on rock and wrestling, positioning himself as a traditionalist disgusted by the circus his sport had become. This led directly to a confrontation with Hulk Hogan, the WWF's ultimate hero, and a series of high-profile altercations involving Lauper. At The War to Settle the Score, broadcast on MTV, the chaos reached a fever pitch, culminating in a wild brawl where Piper attacked Lauper and her manager, an act that generated nuclear heat and made national headlines. Roddy Piper was now more than just the top villain in wrestling, he was a pop culture pariah. He was the man everyone, from wrestling fans to music lovers, wanted to see get beaten. And that is the perfect position for a villain to be in when you're about to launch the biggest gamble in your company's history. To understand why Piper never held the WWF Championship, you have to understand what Vince McMahon was building. This wasn't just a wrestling company anymore. McMahon was building an entertainment empire, a national brand built around a singular, heroic archetype. That hero was Hulk Hogan. Hogan was everything McMahon wanted in a champion. A 6'7", 300-pound behemoth with a movie star physique and a kid-friendly persona. He told fans to train, say their prayers, and eat their vitamins. He was a real-life superhero. The entire business model, the Hulkamania formula, was built around him. The formula was simple, but brutally effective. Hogan was the invincible champion. A series of monstrous villains would be built up, one after another, to challenge him. These villains would cheat and scheme, and then, on the biggest stage, they would fall to Hulk Hogan. This formula sold tickets, moved merchandise, and turned the WWF into a global phenomenon. For this formula to work, the champion had to be a pure babyface. The McMahon family's territory had a long history of heroic champions, like Bruno Sammartino and Bob Backlund holding the title for years. While they weren't totally against heel champions, superstar Billy Graham had a memorable run, it was a rare move. A long-term villain champion was seen as a potential disruption to the family-friendly, hero-driven business model. And this is where Roddy Piper became a problem. He was the antithesis of the Hogan archetype. He was a chaotic, sarcastic, mean-spirited anti-hero who reveled in being hated. Putting the championship on Roddy Piper wouldn't just be crowning a new champion, it would break the entire Hulkamania formula. If the ultimate villain becomes the champion, who does the hero chase? How do you maintain the simple good versus evil narrative that was making everyone rich? Piper was the perfect antagonist for the champion, but he could never be the champion. He was too good at being bad. His role in Vince McMahon's vision was to be the ultimate stepping stone for the ultimate hero. In 1985, Vince McMahon gambled everything on a single event, WrestleMania. It was a high-risk, high-reward spectacle that would either launch the WWF into the stratosphere or bankrupt the company. To make it work, he needed a main event that was bigger than wrestling. That main event pitted WWF champion Hulk Hogan and TV star Mr. T against Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff and the most hated man in America, Roddy Piper. The entire promotion, the entire narrative, was built on Piper's back. The unprecedented interest was driven by one question: would Hulk Hogan and Mr. T finally shut Roddy Piper's mouth? Behind the scenes, tensions were boiling. Piper, a wrestling purist, reportedly despised having a Hollywood actor like Mr. T in the main event of wrestling's biggest show. He saw it as an insult to the business. The friction was so real that Mr. T allegedly feared Piper might go off script and try to legitimately hurt him during the match. But the conflict went deeper. It was about the finish. Piper was adamant. He would not be the one to be pinned. He refused to lose to an actor in the main event of a show that he had built. In his mind, taking that loss would destroy the credibility and the heat he had worked so tirelessly to build. He was the engine, and he wasn't about to let someone pour sugar in his gas tank. Ultimately, a compromise was reached. The finish saw Piper's bodyguard, Cowboy Bob Orton, accidentally hit Paul Orndorff with his cast, allowing Hogan to pin Orndorff for the win. Hogan and Mr. T celebrated, WrestleMania was a monumental success, and wrestling history was changed forever. Roddy Piper, however, left the ring without being pinned. He had fulfilled his role, driven the business to new heights, and, in his own way, won. He protected his character. But in doing so, he had also drawn a line in the sand with Vince McMahon. WrestleMania's success should have been a crowning achievement for everyone. But for Roddy Piper, it was the beginning of a Cold War. The central conflict that would define his WWF career now came into sharp focus: his refusal to do the job cleanly for Hulk Hogan. In wrestling, doing the job means losing a match as planned. It's the fundamental transaction of the business. But for Piper, losing cleanly to Hogan was more than just a loss. It was the death of his character. He believed that if the ultimate villain was decisively conquered by the ultimate hero, his drawing power, the very heat that made him so valuable, would be extinguished. If he became just another notch on Hogan's belt, his mystique would be gone. And so, he refused. This created a backstage stalemate. There is no record of Piper ever being pinned clean by Hogan in the WWF. Their televised matches almost always ended in a disqualification, a countout, or some other chaotic non-finish. From Hogan's perspective, and more importantly from Vince McMahon's, this was a problem. Hulk Hogan himself later stated that he believed Piper would have made a lot more money if he had just taken the pin, suggesting Vince would have rewarded that loyalty. To McMahon, Piper's refusal wasn't just about protecting a character, it was a direct challenge to his authority. Vince McMahon ran his company on a foundation of absolute control. The talent were pieces on his chessboard. Piper, by refusing to be a pawn, was essentially declaring himself a king. This created a fundamental lack of trust. McMahon saw a performer who was prioritizing his own brand over the company's grand strategy. He saw an unpredictable rebel who couldn't be controlled. How could you put your company's richest prize on a man who wouldn't follow the most basic of instructions? You couldn't. It was too great a risk. The stalemate was unbreakable. Piper wouldn't bow to Hogan, and as a result, McMahon would never let him wear the crown. After the feud with Hogan cooled, Piper's career entered a new phase. He took a brief hiatus and, upon his return, found that the fans' reaction to him had shifted. The very things that made him such a great villain, his wit, his charisma, his rebellious streak, were now making him popular. The WWF capitalized on this, turning him into a beloved, albeit still unhinged, babyface. But even as a hero, the glass ceiling remained. He was a main event attraction, but the world title picture was still Hogan's domain. Piper's journey led him not to the WWF Championship, but to its workhorse cousin, the Intercontinental Championship. In early 1992, Piper defeated the Mountie to win the Intercontinental title, his first and only singles championship in the WWF. It was a moment fans had waited years for, a validation of his long career. But in the grand scheme, it felt like a consolation prize. It was an acknowledgement of his star power, but also a clear message. This is as high as you go. His reign was short-lived. It culminated in a classic match at WrestleMania 8 against Bret the Hitman Hart. The match was a masterpiece of storytelling. At one point, with the referee knocked down, the old Roddy Piper emerged. He grabbed the ring bell, contemplating using it as a weapon. For a moment, it seemed the villain would resurface. But Piper, looking at the crowd and his own legacy, threw the bell aside. He chose to fight with honor. He would ultimately lose the match cleanly to Bret Hart. In a profound show of respect, Piper personally fastened the belt around the waist of the new champion, raising his hand. It was a symbolic passing of the torch. The clean loss to Bret, something he would never grant Hogan, showed his immense respect for Hart as a wrestler. But it also cemented his own role. He was not the king, he was the kingmaker. The power struggle between Vince McMahon and Roddy Piper wasn't just confined to the ring, it spilled over into Hollywood. As Piper's fame grew, so did his opportunities outside of wrestling, leading to the next major fracture in their relationship. In 1988, Piper was offered the lead role in a sci-fi action film by legendary director John Carpenter. That film was They Live. It was a huge opportunity. As the story goes, when he told Vince McMahon, the boss was not pleased. This was about control. McMahon wanted his performers to be WWE stars, first and foremost. Any success he didn't orchestrate was a threat to his business model. Piper, true to his nature, chose to do the movie. The film became a cult classic, giving Piper a foothold in Hollywood and a degree of financial independence outside the wrestling bubble. The one great lever of power a promoter holds over talent, financial dependency, was weakened. Piper didn't need Vince McMahon in the same way anymore. A now famous exchange reportedly took place around this time. McMahon told him, "The WWF doesn't need Roddy Piper." Piper looked him in the eye and replied, "Roddy Piper doesn't need the WWF." That independent streak reached its zenith in 1996. The wrestling world was a battlefield, with the WWF locked in a ratings war with its rival, WCW. Hulk Hogan, now a villain, was leading the dominant NWO faction in WCW. And who did WCW bring in as the heroic foil to challenge the newly evil Hogan? Rowdy Roddy Piper. From the WWF's perspective, it was a massive blow. Their greatest villain had joined the enemy to reignite a feud with their greatest hero on the competition's show. It seemed to confirm everything Vince might have feared about Piper. He was a maverick who followed his own path. He was not, and never would be, a company man. Any lingering chance of Piper one day getting that WWF championship moment now seemed gone forever. So, we come back to the central question. What is Roddy Piper's legacy? In an industry that often uses championship reigns to measure greatness, Piper is a paradox. He is, without question, one of the most important figures of his era, yet he lacks the one credential that typically defines a top star. But the truth is, Roddy Piper's legacy isn't defined by the title he never won. It's defined by the fact that he didn't need it. He got over purely on his charisma and his ability to talk. He was a main event draw the second he picked up a microphone. By never winning the WWF Championship, he maintained his status as the ultimate outsider, the eternal rebel. He was the Uncrowned King, a title that, in many ways, is more fitting for his character than champion ever could be. He was the anti-Hogan. Had he won the title and eventually lost it back, as every other heel did, he would have become just another chapter in the book of Hulkamania. By refusing to be conquered, he wrote his own book entirely. His influence is undeniable. Every wrestler who has ever cut a promo that blurred the lines between reality and performance owes a debt to Roddy Piper. Every anti-hero character, from Stone Cold Steve Austin to CM Punk, walks a path that Piper paved. He is consistently ranked among the greatest villains in wrestling history. He even returned to the WWE years later, creating more memorable moments and winning the World Tag Team Championship with Ric Flair in 2006. He proved that a connection with the audience was more powerful than any gold belt. He was so good at being bad that the fans eventually had no choice but to love him for it. He became a legend not because of a promoter's decision, but in spite of it. He was too authentic, too rebellious, and too dangerous to be the corporate champion. And that is precisely what made him a legend. In the end, the story of why Roddy Piper never won the WWF Championship is a story about control. Many believe that Vince McMahon was building an empire with a very specific blueprint, the Hulkamania formula, and that machine required predictable parts. Rowdy Roddy Piper was not a predictable part. He was a chaotic variable. His refusal to lose cleanly to Hogan was a challenge to the system. His success in Hollywood proved he was independent. His eventual defection to WCW proved he was uncontrollable. According to this theory, Vince McMahon's biggest fear wasn't a wrestler who could beat Hulk Hogan. It was a wrestler who didn't need him. A star so powerful on his own that he could threaten the very business model the empire was built on. That was Roddy Piper. Giving him the championship would have been handing the keys to the kingdom to the one man who refused to play by the king's rules. It was a risk Vince McMahon was simply unwilling to take. Piper lost out on the historical footnote of being a world champion, but in exchange, he gained something more enduring, an immortal status as wrestling's greatest rebel, the Uncrowned King who helped build an empire but refused to rule it. But what do you think? Was Vince right to protect his formula? Or would a Roddy Piper championship reign have been the most legendary run of the entire 1980s? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thanks for watching.